Hello everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. Today we're going to paint this sweet little dragonfly and we're going to do some doodling on top of him. We're going to do a lot with the metallic watercolors because dragonflies are so pretty and iridescent. And first thing we're going to do is spray down our 100% cotton Shizen paper. I get it from Cherry's Artorama. It is a 5x7 sheet. And I'm not taping it down. It's 100% cotton, like I said, and it is very good and absorbent, and it does dry nice and flat when it's all done. So I took my fan brush that I wetted down. Every time you see my hand go off to the right side of the video here, it is dipping in my water, and I get it nice and soaked up with some of a warm violet color, Theo Violet if you happen to have Cotman, or a Quinn Violet if you happen to have other brands such as the Daniel Smith. And I tap that onto my paper, and because my paper is wet, it kind of spatters out and spreads out. And then I cleaned off my brush and I went into my sap green and did the same thing right on top of the purple with the wet, damp paper. Now, because this paper is really wet and it holds a lot of moisture, it's cotton, I also did some gold right on top of the wet too, and it gives me this pretty shimmery background with the gold that splatters around as well. I just let this paper dry on its own, so my background was nice and stable before I started painting. If you wanted, you could certainly go ahead and use a heat tool and dry it more quickly. So there's my background. I wanted a little bit stronger purple, so I splattered it with some of that warm violet on a dry paper, and then that way it doesn't spread out as much and the color definitely stays more vivid. So I am not going to draw any of this out. I do have a traceable available on LaDonna's class page, which is on Facebook, and you can ask to join that, and you will have access to all of the traceables and supply lists, even though I will have the supply list down below in the description box of this video. So I used my number 10 round brush. It is a Princeton Elite. That is the brush series that I'm going to be using for this entire painting. And I mixed a equal part of burnt sienna and burnt umber, and I just drew an oval over to the side with my brush, and this is a cattail, so we are going to put a little tip on the top of that cattail with a green. I'm just using the sap green right out of my palette, and also did a sap green stem coming down to the bottom of my page so it's anchored. When I went to do the leaf, I did not have enough paint loaded on my brush, so it was a little bit dry. So I went back in and loaded up with much more paint, and there I got a nice strong stroke. Now you notice that my strokes are kind of curving in from the edge of the paper, and I'm going to do another of these cattails over on the other side, and I'm going to have the leaves curving the opposite direction. So it kind of creates a little vignette for our dragonfly to sit in the middle of, with the border on either side of the cattails. Anytime I have a little extra paint on my brush, I just flick up a couple of grasses from the bottom of my page. So I wanted the one side of my cattail leaves to be, I think they're called reeds actually, to be a little darker. So I added a little bit of Prussian blue to my sap green to darken it up. And I ran that brush right up the inside edge of both of my reeds. And because my paper, there again, holds onto that moisture so nicely, I just ran it up and it will bleed out and soften on its own. When I went to do the other cattail, I had a little bit of that blue on my brush and it ended up making it really too dark. So I cleaned off my brush, dried it, and I just soaked up my paint in the center part of the cattail, and then I went back with my burnt umber, burnt sienna mix and made it a little bit more brown. Once I have both of my cattails painted in, then I did pick up a little bit of black, Mars black, ivory black, does not matter, whatever you have on your palette, and tapped it around my edges to give it a little bit more depth. I cleaned off my brush and I actually picked up a little bit of my cad yellow medium and put that towards the center of my cattails, so it gave it a little bit of a highlight. There I went back into my sap green, drew in my stem, and didn't forget my little extra stem that kind of goes through the center of the cattail and sticks off the top. Let that set up for just a second. And I'll go back and paint in my reeds the same exact way that I did the ones on the right hand side. Nice heavily loaded brush with my sap green and my bigger brush. That way I'm able to pull a nice long strong stroke and get those reeds done all in one swift motion. There again, a little bit of extra on my brush, and these ones I darkened up so I would have some contrast in my greens, and I flicked up some grasses from the bottom of my page. A few of them I kind of tipped back so they looked like maybe they were bent or bending in the wind. But you'll notice that the ones on the right side of the page curve around into the right, and the ones on the left side curve around and come back from the left. There again, we're trying to create this little vignette for our dragonfly to sit in the middle of. I'm just letting that paint that's in the center of those cattails kind of mingle and do its own thing. That is the great thing about this paper. It is 100% cotton rag, and it does hold on to a lot of moisture, so your paints will have time to blend on their own and do that thing that we all like watercolors to do. And I put a little extra dark green at the bottom to anchor my piece. Just tapped it in. Went back, reinforced some of my darker edges. So once it sat just for a minute or so, it kind of stabilized the color, I did go back with some burnt sienna, and I just tapped it in with the tip of my brush. Kind of a tap, tap, tap along the edges of both my cattails. Give it a little bit more texture and a little bit more depth of color. Now we're going to get a little bit of gold shimmer in those cattails. So I activated my paints already. I sprayed them down with my spray bottle. Let them set for a few seconds. These are the Finetec paints. This is the 12 color palette. I use it a ton. As you can tell, a lot of my paints have already worn through to the bottom of the palette. I used that orangey coppery color, and I tapped that in right next to the burnt sienna that I did around the edges. And then in the very center, I'm going to use that greenish gold color and tap that in. And there again, this is still fairly wet, so those paints are going to have a chance to blend a little bit. You'll notice I'm jumping around back and forth, and that way I don't have to dry my paper in between. It just has time to do it on its own. Then I loaded up my brush nice with that green gold color, and I ran a nice heavy stripe of that up the inside of each one of my reeds and also down the center of my cattail stem. I have a good heavy load of that paint on my brush, and you'll notice that it really does shine right from the very beginning. This paint is so mica intense. You get great brilliance out of it. I'm just kind of putzing a little bit. It's just fun to add a little bit of color, give it a few seconds to sit, to not be in a hurry. Alright, so the majority of my cattails are done and they're mostly dry. The reason I want them a little bit drier is I have this terrible habit of sticking my hand in my wet paints. Alright, so we're going to start in on our dragonfly, and I like painting my wings first. They're kind of in an X shape, a flattened out, squished down X is how I always think of my dragonfly wings. Once again, I did not draw this out, but there is that traceable available at LaDonna's class page on Facebook. I mixed up a very thin mix of that same warm purple, that phthalo purple or theo purple or quinacridone purple, whatever color you have. It's a nice warm purple, or any color you like. It works out really well too if you use aquas or even grays, because dragonflies come in all different colors. So I mixed a very thin mix of that, and I drew in my general shape, and then I added some more water onto my brush, and I just filled in the center. I want it to be quite transparent because, of course, dragonfly wings, you can see through them. Then I clean off and dry off my brush, and I soaked up some of that paint in the center part of my wings, but I left the edges a little bit darker. And then I did even go back with a little bit dioxazine purple and went just the tiniest little bit around my edges, so I would have some shadowing around my edges. So I do the same thing on this side here. I draw that long oval shape and just add a little bit of extra water onto my brush, no more paint, and filled it in. Then I clean off my brush and I soak up the center part of that wing so it looks a little bit more transparent. Then I go back and I put in that little tiny bit of dioxazine purple around the damp edges of my wings, and because this paper, once again, holds on to the moisture so nicely, that purple should dissipate and you'll get a nice soft blend. So with all four of the wings in there, you can kind of see the shape of it already. And then I mixed up from my Finetec the white pearl color that is in that palette, and I just ran a streak of that right up the center of each wing there. You can see me mixing it up. I make sure that it's really good and incorporated and activated, and I run it right up the center, and that gives you that beautiful iridescent shimmer that dragonflies have. I am going to let these wings dry for a minute or so because I don't want the wings bleeding into my body. But while they are still a little bit damp, but not too damp. I did mix up some of that black that was on my palette, and I gave some markings on the dragonfly wings. They are just kind of a little, almost triangular shaped scribble that starts at the top of each wing. And I just did a little scribble of it down about halfway, getting thinner as my little scribble comes towards the center of the wing. Some dragonflies do have some markings on their wings. And because this paper is still pretty wet, that's going to soften a lot as it dries. All right, so now I'm just going to paint in the body. Now when you do a dragonfly, they're kind of a basic shape, and you're going to paint two really large ovals right next to each other, right above those wings for the head, because when you look at a dragonfly, the entire head is 99% of it is eye. They are a predator after all, and they're going to eat up all those dang mosquitoes. So they need to be able to see what they're flying towards. So they've got two big ovals for their eyes, and that will be right above the wings. And then I fill in between my wings with a light mix of a gray that is just my black. That's very, very thinned out. And then a long, long, thin tail that they have coming down from the wings. One of the things is that with dragonflies, their tail is literally as long as their wings are. So that really will help you get the proportion of their body correct. And you just draw that down very lightly with your black, and then you can go back in and wash off and dry off your brush and pick up some of that black from the center. Give yourself a little bit of a highlight. Can you see how those wings dried, and the markings on them are very, very subtle once it dries. So just working a little bit on that body, making sure he's nice and straight. Then I'm going to mix up from my Finetec paint again. There is a dual chrome paint in this set that is a green, black, and purple almost. So I'm going to use some of that down the center of the body. And once again, give our dragonfly that shimmer and iridescent that is so pretty on them. And I'm using the white pearl to paint in his eyes even more. Give him a lot more detail and definition on those eyes because they're such an important part of a dragonfly. And a little bit of that silver white pearl right down the center of the back on the edges there. Once again, give a little bit more definition. So we're going to let this dry because if we start drawing on it right now, our pens are not going to work so good because they don't like drawing on wet paint. We are going to be using a white Uniball pen and a black brush pen that is a small fine brush pen. There are a lot of different companies that make them. You can even use a brush pen Sharpie, but I did try and use my 0.5 Sakura Micron, and I also tried to use a black gel pen, and neither of them worked because this paper has so much texture on it that I did have to go to the brush pen, which worked really, really well. The only negative is this particular brush pen that I'm using is not waterproof. So once I am done with this, I cannot go back over it with any water because that black will bleed. And believe me, I found that out the hard way on my sample piece. Now, he looks pretty cute like this, so if you don't want to do your doodles, you certainly don't have to. I just find them kind of fun to do once I have the basic in of my shapes and my colors, but it's pretty dang cute just like this. So if you want to stop here, absolutely go right ahead. So that is that brush pen, and I'm just going to outline my wings and my leaves and do some little scribbly around my cattails. I did go over a few of those little markings that were on the wings just to pop that up a little bit. So when I went over the cattails, I also did a few little squiggles kind of inside on top of the dark brown and the little black shadows. Give it a little more texture and give it a little bit more of that rough, fuzzy look that cattails have. Don't worry about being perfect about going over every single edge so it's super precision. The doodling is just supposed to add a little bit more dimension and be fun for you to do. Don't stress on it. You'll notice that I did not take this video upside down. This video is done the right way, but I happen to like to do my drawing upside down. There we go, flip it around for you. Alright, so I did not do a lot of the white. I only used the white on the inside of the wings and a little bit of highlight on each of the eyes. I went around the inside perimeter of the wings, inside of the black outline I had done, and I also used the white to add those really subtle little veins that are on the wings as well. And then I took some of my burnt umber and I thinned it down a lot. So it's very soft and transparent. And I gave a few little reeds that were coming up also, just for a little bit more dimension. So make sure that you check out Stitchesbrew on Etsy, Instagram, Wix.com, and